So yeah, this piece is really about just conversations with people who are working with other people in some kind of role of influence or leadership, and yeah, wanting to pull out juicy, interesting, poignant threads of what is getting in our way, what is really supporting our transformation and our potential, and as a practitioner or coach, like what do you see, what do you notice, what are you feeling challenged by? I just want the dialogues to be for sure supportive to individuals that are looking for change and transformation, but also hopefully supportive to other coaches that they can, just add to their skill set and their knowledge base. So,
Cool.
You had mentioned to me wanting to talk about human potential, and in particular, sort of this intersectionality between sort of wisdom and Eastern traditions of spirituality and sort of exploring consciousness, and then maybe some of the more practical Western tools and sort of psychological knowledge that's coming through in terms of research and what we're seeing about the human condition. So that's very much aligned with the kind of work I do. I talk about integration a lot. So how do we bring these two spaces or fields of being human together in a way that's powerful and that allows people to maybe see things they're not easily seeing on their own. So that's my kind of like preamble. Maybe just introduce yourself and tell me if there's something particular about what I just said that you want to talk about today, or if there's just anywhere you want to start around that world of transformation and coaching.
Sure. Yeah. My name is Deus Fortier. I'm a human potential coach. I'm the founder of the Impeccable Men Masterclass, which is a combination of a structured curriculum for guiding men to a place of emotional intelligence and personal power, and one-on-one coaching, group coaching, and a community of men all coming together. And I found that those three elements, the structured curriculum, the personalized guidance, and the community, were all essential components to actually creating some sort of sustained transformation in a person's life. Because up until the point of that offering that I started putting out, my exposure to transformation came from mostly through immersive experiences. Like I would leave everything and go and stay at an ashram for 6 months, or I would go to like an intensive workshop retreat. And then I'd come back into my day-to-day life and I'd be super inspired and empowered for a short period of time, like this spike that would slowly peter off. And it actually created a lot of anger and resentment in me towards having to actually engage in life. I just wanted to like remove myself permanently and go find some sort of safe haven. That's why I wanted to be a monk back when I was 21, because I wanted to remove myself from the challenges and obstacles of day-to-day living, which was where the integration was really taking place. So I found that most people weren't actually teaching integration. How do we bring these concepts, these traditions, whether they're modern or whether they're ancient, and actually apply them in day-to-day living, in practical application in our modern world? So the whole field of human potential is so vast and so broad. I could talk about it forever because it's the thing that I care most about right now. But maybe I'll zone into the three components that I found to be really effective in helping myself and other men actually integrate these principles, because I think that's a really fascinating place to start with the structured curriculum, like a step-by-step process that a person is individually responsible for consuming and then implementing. And then also the addition of personalized guidance, like how that's showing up in the specific scenario of a person's life. And then community, the knowing that they're not alone on this journey. Because I think that that is the biggest struggle that I went through personally, and that I find most men in right now, is that they feel like they're alone. And there's like a lot of shame and avoidance and hiding and posturing that men go through to try to give the impression that everything is fine. They got everything under control. I mean, I'm really not enjoying my third marriage, and I'm angry all the time, and I tend to isolate myself for extended periods of time. And I don't actually have any friends, but I'm totally fine. You know, it's like a bunch of bullshit that we're taught to present ourselves as being successful and healthy and put together, and it is destroying so many men. They tend to approach me almost like in a whisper, like, hey, I saw you talking about this thing and I'm actually struggling with it a little bit. How's that going for you? Oh, it's not too bad. It's just, I haven't experienced a healthy relationship, And so the community aspect is so important, which is why I wanted to chat with you about this, because I know that you're engaged in this type of work. And you actually came up a few days ago and somebody was talking about, they went on to one of your programs. It was a immersive, I think it was a full day, maybe it was a week thing. And they were talking about a process that you sat a person down and they would move from chair to chair, talking with themselves in a conversation while being witnessed by an entire group of people. I thought that was fucking brilliant. I don't know if I'm allowed to swear on this.
You're totally allowed.
So maybe I just wanted to start there and see what insights or reflections you might have about the need for community and transparency in regards to this work that we're doing specifically as men.
Yeah. Awesome. I mean, I love the way you're speaking about it. It's concise. It's really clear that you've been moving in dialogue about this, that it's practiced for you in terms of being able to articulate these concepts that I think for a lot of people are hard to encapsulate. So thank you for that. And I really relate to what you're saying about having these big awakening experiences, these peak experiences, getting it, quote unquote, getting it, as many of us do at different times in our lives for various reasons. And then we come back into the familiar life, in familiar relationships, work environments, and something in us knows that we're meant to keep going with what we awakened to. And what I would say about that is that the reason it so consistently fades over time is that there's significant cost in living our awakening. And my sense is that it's a cost that for us to stay true to the awakening, it is the end of our old life. And as much as we might tell ourselves and others that we want life to be different, I think the idea people have is that they want it to be different in the ways they want it to be different, and they want it to stay the same in the ways they want it to stay the same. And that's not how transformation works.
Right.
It's like, if you really want transformation, it's wholesale. It's a really different context for a different life that doesn't necessarily deliver you the things you thought you wanted. It delivers you more of what's real. And so I think that's one of the dilemmas of transformation, especially if you're doing the work of transformation. And the pieces you talked about in terms of structure, one-to-one support, and mentorship, you might call it, and community, I think we're starving for it, all three of those things. And then we find structure where we can find it, but it's not necessarily structure that's for what's of most value. So we might get into a work environment that's very structured, or maybe a fitness environment that's very structured. But if that structure isn't for something that's deeper than just some surface outcome, what ends up happening, I find, for people is they get the thing they thought they wanted, and within short order, they realize that wasn't it. And now they have to create another carrot, another something to achieve. And that's especially for men, the kind of conveyor belt or the hamster wheel of achieving. But if you're not achieving the very next thing, and then the very next thing, then your value in the world, at least in your perception, might fade with it. So I'm really clear about context being key for what is my motive for doing this. If it's self-oriented, it's not going to work. We grew out of an evolutionary context of community, and now, even though we're surrounded by people in these kind of metropolitan areas, community for me is still elusive for us, for most people. And growing, it's not easy. I think it involves how do you grow real community in the midst of densely populated areas that don't have it? What does intrinsic human community really look and feel like? And then there's an existing culture, an existing society that is full of things that seem to be community, but if we're starving for connection in the midst of all these people, clearly it's not It's not what I would call organic community.
Totally.
So, yeah,
I agree. I experienced that when I moved here to Vancouver about 5 years ago, most prominently, because up until like for most of my 20s, I was spending time in spiritual communities, ashrams, those kind of immersive experiences, and found a lot of benefit in doing that. I was actually very, very good at finding environments that supported me in the ways that I needed. And I found that when those external support structures weren't there, I would just collapse back into old programs, old ways of being, even if I thought I had actually transformed in some significant ways. And I discovered when I moved here to Vancouver that it's called the Lonely City. I didn't know that. And I have relatives here. I've been visiting them like every year, basically, ever since I was a child. And I'd never heard that until I moved here. And man, was that true for me. I moved here and I was just like plunged into a deep loneliness and depression for like the first year that I was here. And as time has unfolded and I've started to actually build a few different circles of communities and friends and acquaintances, so many of them are talking about community. Like, how do we build community? This is so important. And then there's the aspect of like one of my roommates actually is, his website is Bridges to Next Culture. He's trained in possibility management, which is all about collaborative, winning is happening scenarios, like coming together as a group in transparency. Some of my other friends on Salt Spring Island are all about Tamara. Have you heard of Tamara?
Yeah.
Before? Very different approach to community than what most people have been exposed to here in the Western world. But I agree with what you're saying. Like, it's not really present that in any way that I've been exposed to here in the city, you know? And so when I hear these people talking about community, my mind goes to, we don't even know what that looks like. You know, we're just like coming up with mind maps of what we think it should look like based on what people used to do when we were living in villages, you know? So we need to come together and we need to buy land and we need to be self-sustainable on like 11 acres or whatever it is, you know? And that's great for those people who can do it. But how do we do it here in the modern world? You know? And it's amazing that you and I have the ability to communicate via Zoom right now and have this kind of conversation. And man, I got to say, I have like wrestled tooth and nail with technology. I've wanted so badly not to engage with social media, with Zoom, with email sequences, with all of these things that are a necessary element of actually building a business in the current landscape of our society. But I'm starting to realize now that maybe technology is representative of some sort of inherent need that we have as humans and the inherent capacity that we have as humans. It's just an extension of that. And so I'm starting to realize experientially the capacity that technology has for actually building a global sense of community that can be sustained, but it requires the involvement of each individual in a way that I think we're not really used to for a whole bunch of reasons, which is why I loved hearing about that exercise that you had about somebody having a conversation with themselves being witnessed by another person or a group. You know, having those types of really vulnerable, painful even processes that lead to some sort of self-generated experience of illumination and enlightenment, whether it's guided by another or a group or however it is, that being visible to other people so that we can all experience that together as a collective is, to me, one of the necessary components of what it means to actually build community. So many people are trying to like remove themselves. This is what I was doing for years, remove themselves to do their work, you know, their work. And then they come back so that they can present a really beautiful persona. Like, I have done all my work now. I am ready to engage with the world in a clean and respectable fashion. And that's not what's happening behind the closed doors of anybody's home. You know, you walk into the homes or the communities that are alive, the seminars that are actually taking place where people are doing this kind of work. It's messy. You know, it's sloppy. It's a deconstruction of the entire identity and worldview that has built the entire personality construct that a person is engaging in the world with. It's a really destructive, sloppy process. And I think that is what people are actually yearning for that they are labeling as community. Like, where are the spaces where I can actually be a total mess and still be held and supported and accepted and liberated from this prison of constantly having to filter and suppress and repress and modify who I am in order to find acceptance and validation and positive reinforcement, which is just built on societal values. It's just a whole bunch of bullshit. So this is like one of the things that I don't think most people really comprehend when they're saying, I want more community. What I hear is, I want to be a part of really uncomfortable processes, and I want to be witnessed in that for myself, because I know that that is the thing that actually builds a deeper level of connection and intimacy and trust in a meaningful, lasting way, which means we actually have to accept all of the things that we disagree with, that we find challenging, and that we resist and resent. It is very, very confronting. You know, so community as like a very lofty, I don't know, super spiritual, harmonious environment, I don't think is the reality of things. It's more being honest and being real with what is actually alive with each other in a way that actually encourages the differences and encourages the challenge, because it's being perceived in a proper frame. This is necessary for the unleashing of the fullness of who you really are, that you've been trying to hide for so long. And it's exhausting.
Yeah. Well, what comes to me as you speak is, and I've been really like in this sort of trajectory of exploring concepts. And what I'm really discovering is that we're not at all what we think we are, human beings. Most accurately, what I would say a human being is we're a space. We're a space within which life is dancing and moving. And we actually have an ability to choose the kind of space that we are, which then influences the dance. And community is similar. We think community is like people and stuff. Community is a space, and it's for something. And I think the biggest challenge we have is that we don't know what it's for. And so then we construct meaning. We fabricate what community is for. We create ideological perspectives and frameworks, and then we try to stick community in there, and it doesn't work. And that community is the most natural thing. Take human beings out of it and just look at an ecosystem. There's a space there, and the space is informing how all of the organisms within that space are interacting, and what gets created is something that is so clearly more than the sum of its parts. That's the magic of life. That's the magic of a complex system. And I think human beings have the challenge of having all of these self-created, self-oriented ideals and ideas, and then we carry those with us into community. And now there's no room for community to happen because I got my stuff. And if my stuff doesn't fit with your stuff, well, who's the problem? Well, clearly you're the problem. I'm me. So, and there's a problem here. So, or we just make ourselves wrong. And again, there's no space for real relationship and real community. And so like the piece that you're talking about around what we're yearning for is a space where we can be what we really are, which includes the mess, which includes the sticky, prickly stuff, and not feel like we're at risk of being excommunicated. To not feel like because I have what I have, which mostly I was born into and maybe I participated in along the way, but mostly we got what we got. And now I feel like I don't belong because I got what I got. That's a very disenfranchising reality to live in. And I think it's the reality that a lot of men, I mean, men and women for sure, but because we're wanting this conversation to be a bit more focused, I think men are struggling to reconcile that feeling of I don't belong and all of the shame and self-loathing that might go along with that. And what I also believe we all carry, which is some deeper, more intrinsic sense that we do belong in a way that is like cannot be defiled. It cannot be taken from us, but it's quiet. It's quiet and authentic and isn't going to yell over top of all of what we've laid on top of life. So how do we transition? How do we support that kind of change? I mean, here, this is, for me, this is the only place I have direct access to transformation. In my relationships, because of the transformation here, I might be able to influence someone else, but it's not actually my choice to transform someone else. Mm-hmm. So it's cliche, of course, but if I want to change the world, right here, this is my portal and my vehicle for transforming the world. And then the piece that I love, just the flavor of how you spoke about it, is if I do transform this piece, it's just true that I'm meant to be in the world, fully in the world with a transformed self that then provides that for others, that then becomes a beacon or a container or a reflection for others of what an integrated human being can be. That's it. It can be that simple. What that looks like, well, that's a million different things. But I think we get ahead of ourselves in terms of building community, in terms of change, in terms of helping others. I don't know if you're into Jordan Peterson at all. I'm sure you've spoken about him with people, but you know, one of his pieces is like, get your house in order. That's like number one on his 12 things. And I totally agree with that. I think if we're out there trying to fix or change and inside it's a mess, that's what we're going to deposit into the world. Even if our ideas are very altruistic, we're going to deposit our mess into the relationships with people and into spaces that we travel in because we haven't taken the time to clean our vessel out.
For sure. And this is where it gets super interesting. I agree with everything you're saying. And it starts getting into the nitty gritty of how do we actually do that? You know, have you ever heard of Bruce Sanguin before?
Doesn't sound familiar.
Bruce Sanguin is he's not super popular. He's a psychotherapist who's here out on the West Coast, and he was one of the keynote speakers at last year's Spirit Plant Medicine Conference. He wrote an amazing book called Dismantled, and he has made this thought map around how trauma is formulated and his journey of transmuting his trauma through falling in love, having his life in the clergy completely collapse, and working with plant medicines. And he talks about, in his experience, and this has been true from my experience as well, which is why I resonated with it, that the healing of trauma happens in relationship. And so whenever I would go off on my own and I would be super spiritual and I would meditate for 4.5 hours a day and I would study and journal and do all my creative exercises and I'd feel amazing. And then I'd come into relationship and all this shit would come back up that I thought I was totally over, especially when I'm with my family, you know, and that the relational container, that relational space is actually the crucible that integrates transformation of trauma. Because it's not just individual, it's also generational, it's also social. There's relational dynamics that are built into the fabric of the trauma that is being perpetuated on an individual and collective level. So it's interesting because what I see what is happening right now on some level in our society is this rise of like the social justice warrior in a whole bunch of different iterations. You know, people are latching onto a cause that they are fighting tooth and nail for. You know, it's like a reclamation of, no, I am going to say no because I deserve to say no. And it's like this, trying to build this sense of self-worth again, of giving themselves permission to actually declare a boundary, but also to advocate for their needs. You know, it's like in some way through the sequence of the generations, people have been amalgamated into a social construct of a human. And they seem to be trying to individuate themselves, like to find who they really are outside of the soup of all of the things that we've been trained we're supposed to be in order to be a productive, successful member of society. So I'm seeing like a simultaneous desire to distance from the collective, but it's paradoxical because those people congregate together, you know? So it's forming like little pockets of people who share who are in the same relative place on their reclamation process. So it's interesting to advocate for this really deep personal work, which is radical self-responsibility. Really, it's seeing that knowing that everything that you're experiencing is being influenced by and filtered through your own internal state. It's affecting the way your brain works, the emotional reactivity, the beliefs that are being plastered onto everything that we're experiencing. Taking that beyond theory and actually applying that in the scenarios where we're triggered is a big part of the work. It's that responsibility. But then we're also longing for these collective spaces where that is understood, rather than advocating for some sort of external condition. Like, hey, this is the thing that made Jordan Peterson so famous. He was against the, what was it? It was the writing of legislation. He was against the legislation of a certain pronoun,
Compelled language.
Compelled language, as the thing that will solve people's problems, and seeing through the fallacy of that and actually having the courage to declare, actually, if I'm being forced to say something, I will not say that. I have a problem with that as a foundation for solving our problems. We need to find something deeper than that. And having that actually activate a social conversation around what are we actually trying to do here as a collective? What is the end goal that we're shooting for?
Yeah, and I think we're not clear about that. And even if we think we're clear, I don't think we've got it in terms of a relevant goal for humanity. And so then we're kind of lost. We're using a map and compass that doesn't belong on the terrain that we're on, and we're wondering why we're so lost. That's sort of the analogy that I would use. And the discovery of the right map and compass for me, for sure, it's an inward discovery. And I love what you're saying. Like I worked with attachment quite a bit. I worked with a lot of people with fairly significant trauma histories and using attachment theory to work with them. And there's another guy, David Cross. I was at a conference with him, and he created a whole methodology for working with children who had experienced trauma, and then working with behavioral challenges that might go along with sort of those kids. And he said something similar. He said all trauma is relational trauma, even neglect, because human beings are relational creatures. So the absence of relationship is a relational trauma. And I thought that was really an interesting perspective. And so because of that, trauma can only fully heal in the context of relationship. Right. And so then the question becomes, okay, well, where is the balance point or where is the entry point of transformation? And I still believe it's here. It just doesn't stop here. Because if I make relationship the source of my healing, in a funny way, I'm externalizing responsibility. That the responsibility for me lies here. And that includes living my life in relationship with others. And so then it naturally encompasses taking advantage of my interactions with people and my relationships to integrate. And I don't mind talking about and identifying and defining trauma, but I prefer that there are ways in which our system didn't develop optimally, and that what we call healing is just an integration of those ineffective patterns.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so then we don't have to label it as something that's like wrong or bad or even something to fix. We're not broken if we've experienced trauma. There's opportunity to integrate pieces that just didn't come together in a full way. Perfect. How do we do that? Well, I mean, there's a million things. I think we're getting close to the end of our scheduled time. I think we'll have to schedule a full podcast because I'm enjoying this. But I think when we have a moment of clarity, and then I like to talk about things like a near-death experience or the death of a loved one, or something where the more accurate recognition of what life is really about is right there in our face.
Mm-hmm.
And in a way, our whole priority list gets shuffled back into its sort of more accurate configuration. In those moments, what I believe the human condition realizes is that it's all about how we are with life. It's not about the content of life. It's about the context we're creating for life. That is everything. And that's the point where we get to start to make new choices. Like even all the research around mindfulness and meditation. A guy named Daniel Siegel that I talk about quite a bit. He's a psychiatrist by trade, but he's done a lot of really cool stuff, created a whole field of study called interpersonal neurobiology, which is like a really global perspective on the human condition. You'd love it if you checked it out if you haven't already. But he talks about being present as the plane of possibility. So instead of it being everything psychological is biological, that's sort of a psychological concept, that there's this biological system and it's doing things and it's creating our psychology, that there's a point of access, I would call it a dimension of access, that's all about present awareness, conscious present awareness, and that somehow that a shift of conscious present awareness opens up new channels of choice for us in the present moment that wouldn't have been possible if that shift of conscious awareness didn't happen. And so that's the beginning, that's the genesis of real change, and that can then flow into every area of our life. Like, when am I going to go to bed tonight? What kind of food am I going to put in my body? Am I going to go and hang out with my buddy that likes to get loaded and break stuff? Or am I going to go and, sit with my cousin who we always have these philosophical, like these little forks in the road. Sometimes we don't even see the choice until we get present. And all of a sudden these pathways that were always there that we weren't seeing reveal themselves. And now a new life becomes possible, but we still have to be there and make the choice as we go. And then that's like what we started with, which is having the transformation, seeing new possibility in your life. But then as the weeks go, we find ourselves living the same life we did before that experience. And that's the rub, is that no one is responsible but us in our lives.
Yeah, I love what you're saying. That, what did you call it? Access point, the dimension of something?
Daniel Siegel calls it the plane of possibility.
Plane of possibility.
And I look at it as like beyond the three spatial and the single temporal dimensions of what we usually consider human life, there is this dimension of conscious awareness. Whatever you want to call it, I don't mind. I'm not so worried about words, but there is this way in which we can, in an instant, shift how we are with life. Nothing else needs to change. We're still who we are. We have our conditioning, we have our perceptions, but there's a way in which that we can shift in relationship to life. It is what the essence of meditation is about. And that actually makes all the difference.
Yeah, for sure. I'm reminded of Paramahansa Yogananda. You familiar with him?
No.
He's the author of Autobiography of a Yogi. So
yeah,
he has an organization called Self-Realization Fellowship, and he teaches the very comprehensive system of Kriya Yoga, which is a full yogic path. And part of Yogananda's mission was to unite the teachings of the East and the West, and to share that Krishna and Christ were actually sharing the same message, even though the teachings seem very paradoxical in a lot of ways. Like, Christ is teaching the power of forgiveness, the supreme power of forgiveness and humility, whereas Krishna is on the battlefield with Arjuna, telling Arjuna that he has to fight in a war against his own family to reclaim a kingdom that he doesn't even want. And Arjuna's like, I don't want to fight. And Krishna says, you have to fight. This war isn't about you. You are a virtuous man. And while Duryodhana, the evil king of the Kurus, is on the throne, the entire kingdom will suffer. This isn't about you. And so the Bhagavad Gita is an entire dispensation of all of the universal laws and secrets and the soul's unfoldment from supreme realization. as the guru to the disciple, or the supreme consciousness to the individualized consciousness. And so these teachings that seem diametrically opposed, like you have to fight in this war, or like turn the other cheek, the thing that actually bridges them to me is what you're speaking to right now. It's a very, very subtle and very simple, like refinement of orientation. Like, how do I relate to the scenario at hand, rather than creating these cemented protocols of behavior and venerating this thing and attacking or destroying this thing. This whole polarity of this is good, this is bad, this is right, this is wrong, is actually distracting us from the immediate and full experience of what it is that is taking place for us. So two of my friends actually recently were speaking on this just over the last week or so. One of my mentors, Satyan, who I'm sure you know, and then one of my clients, Michael Smith, who's the co-founder of CFAR, which is the Center for Applied Rationality. And he was just talking on the coaching call last night about how his intention for 2020 is to be fully present with the decisions that he's making, and to be fully present with the consequences of them, and to enjoy the full spectrum of what unfolds, whether it's deemed by most people as pleasant or unpleasant. He's moving into experiencing it and enjoying it, whatever it is, even if it's like a hangover, like relishing in the experience of a hangover, where he got sick over Christmas and he was vomiting up some bad shrimp that he had. And he was actually thanking the feeling as it was flowing through him. And he said the experience that he had was, the feeling was actually a little confused that it was being received so well. Like it wasn't used to that. And that he started actually nurturing a relationship with this really uncomfortable sensation. And I loved that. And that's only possible if we are implementing what you're describing right now, and we're fully present with the totality of an experience without throwing it into the cage of a judgmental classification of good or bad, but actually just being present with the unique qualities of that experience that are flowing through the space of our humanity.
Yeah. And as much as I love what you're saying, it's a tough sell, because mostly we've been taught a transactional way of being in life. I do this so that. And the most essential truth of what we're talking about isn't transactional. It's fundamentally alive and makes nothing wrong about whatever arises in life. It happens to be that there's incredible flowerings of that, like that what that does in your life and what that does in yourself is miraculous and beautiful, and you do get to experience incredible joy from it, but not right away necessarily. That the dark night of the soul that's been coming up in conversation a lot for me. When you're okay with whatever arises, if that's the reality of what's there in you, if you have some unresolved stuff, generational stuff even, you might have a long dark night of the soul in being open to what's arising. And if you carry any idea into that says, I'm going to become okay with life as is so that it gets better, your openness won't last very long.
This leads to like a paradox that I was struggling with a lot when I was 21, 22 at the ashram, because there's these stories of these great masters being quite aggressive, like again, with Jesus, like whipping everybody out of the temple, all the merchants, and of Yogananda getting ferocious about securing his charter ticket across to North America. And even the people that I respect and admire the most in this world, who embody like the greatest sense of genuine humility that I've come across in my life, they have emotions just like everybody. They have a whole spectrum of feelings and expressions that they oscillate between. And I was listening to this one talk, monastic brother Bhaktananda, and he was talking about your peace, not letting anybody get your goat, and your goat is your peace. And I was asking one of the monks about this. I'm like, so what about feeling? You know, what about the expression of things? Are we just supposed to be like neutral and calm all the time? Because this is what I see people doing when they're trying to be spiritual. They like put on a persona of equilibrium regardless of what's happening inside of them, and it just turns into a whole bunch of spiritual bypassing. You know, they're trying to like sedate everything to a place of numbness, and to them that is like the state of peace that they're seeking, but it's actually just an escape route. And there's this interesting phenomenon that I've been experiencing since I began that inquiry of there's a difference between, or there's at least a deeper level of feeling. There's like an emotional experience which has very specific like biological and neurological, psychological consequences. But then there's these deeper, more subtle realms of feeling that are more challenging to speak about. The realm of intuition, which is almost indescribable sense of knowing that actually includes but extends beyond just emotion. It actually includes a lot of qualities of mind and relational perception on these really subtle realms. And so the experience of being able to actually sink into, rest into a place of peace while experiencing something like anger simultaneously started happening, and bringing the awareness to these seemingly contradictory experiences that were occupying the same space, actually, that we are capable of way more than we think we are on a feeling capacity, that we can actually be in an experience of discomfort to the greatest degree while still remaining peaceful on some level of our being, which is what I hear you speaking of, you know, where it's, the goal is not to create like a steady experience of like emotional satisfaction, you know, or like orchestrating external relationship or environment to give us some sort of supportive external structure, but is developing some sort of internal capacity to maintain that place of almost invisible peace while in the midst of a fully activated human experience, you know, but not placing identity there, but placing identity on something much more subtle that the mystics and the gurus and the saints and the sages are speaking to, which is why language and teaching gets so nuanced and sloppy, because it can't be understood intellectually. That doesn't make sense logically, that you can be experiencing peace and rage at the same time. And yet I've experienced these things simultaneously, and the masters are speaking about it, you know? And I think a core element of that is where we place identity, which changes automatically when we're able to actually come into the present moment. And maybe that's the place of the tools, the techniques, the mindsets, the methodologies, the meditations. These are exercises to activate that direct experience of present moment awareness that zooms out identity and vision, spaciousness, to be able to hold, not hold, because holding is containing, but to be able to allow the fullness of what exists to percolate and to pass through without being constricted or restrained. And that in itself is transformational for people without having to change anything external.
Yeah, and I would say, and I think I probably will ruffle feathers with that. I know I have in the past, but my take is actually that it's not the methodologies and the techniques and the meditations that do that. I think they can bring us into an experience that allows us to see it, but that expansive sort of non-personal identification that allows us to see the fullness of what's occurring is our most natural state of being. That there's actually a kind of closing off and separating from reality that's required for us not to be in that state. The tools, I think, are when people can't see it and don't get it, you can use the tools to allow them. It's like there's 1,000 doorways to God. I get that. But once you've walked through one, you actually now have a direct route. As soon as we know it, we don't need the technique anymore, except if there's some recognition that the development of our nervous system benefits from the practice. That's what practice is for me. That's what the best use of practice is, not to access our most innate state, right? That's like doing to be. It actually doesn't make sense to try to do something to be what you already are. In fact, it separates you. But once we know what we really are and we have a state of being that's authentic, then the practices are, for me, it's like the palette that we're painting our life with. What am I creating? This is my vehicle. What I do with it changes what it's able to do. And so then I can make choices that aren't so serious about what I'm going to develop. Is there some reason acute awareness of my breath is beneficial? Awesome. But I wouldn't recommend someone use something like a pranayama to get in relationship with their authentic state of being. Because, and I've talked with meditators and yogis who have done it for 30 and 40 years, and then they have an awakening that shatters what they thought they were doing with their breath.
Right.
It's like, oh, I didn't need to do all of that to be what I am. But then it's not like a shame or a punishment or a wrong making. It's just when you know that it's your authentic being, you don't need a practice for it.
Right.
So then that creates a whole other conversation around, okay, well, what are we meant to use our practices for? So it's a good conversation. I'm not saying get rid of practice. I trained athletes for years. If we want to compete and win a medal, we need to train. But if I'm training my athletes with a technique and I'm trying to get them to get their beingness, I'm just confusing them. So it's like, anyway, we could talk about this for hours.
Yeah, it's an interesting paradox, because this is the challenge of any spiritual teaching, because they're like a frame for this thing that you can't actually get if you're applying the frame that's being given. So it's like, what the fuck do we do?
Yeah. And then it's why so many people have gotten it wrong. And by no means are all teachers created equals, right? Some teachers don't actually know what they're talking about, and some teachers do. I love all of the Zen stories about when the guru or the teacher is really harsh or edgy. I know that can be a true way to teach. But I also know there's a lot of people in positions of power and authority and in the role of teacher who use, control and use a kind of violent method of teaching, and they're not grounded in love.
Right.
And then it's no good. Then they're just doing what they think is a good idea.
Yeah, it's a really delicate realm. Like, if somebody is coming to ask for support in the unfolding of who they really are, in the present moment, it's like a handing over of everything. It's the deepest place of trust that they could be putting themselves in. It's not something to be taken lightly.
Yeah, man. We went a little over time. I'm happy that we did. I also want to be respectful of your time.
Yeah, I would love to keep chatting with you.
Yeah.
I have another call at 5.
Yeah,
so.
Yeah, cool. So anything for you to close, and I would love to make another time. And the podcast that I do is 90 minutes. And so if you want to jam on again and either pick some of this stuff up or pick some new topics, I would love to do that sometime in the new year.
Cool, man. Yeah, definitely interested in that.
Yeah, cool. So anything to close the conversation?
I think that everything is a lot simpler than we're all making it out to be. And the complexity is almost like a symptom of the very thing that we're trying to work on. And one of the things that I always remember from my teacher is that the closer we are to God, the more childlike we become. Not childish, but childlike, in that place of uninhibited, spontaneous, creative flow, allowing the fullness of any experience to arise and fall naturally. And that is what I hope for all of us. And I know that we can do it together if we have more of these conversations and we do this kind of work together in a transparent container that is allowing for the sloppiness, as we come back to these places of simplicity. So thank you very much for inviting me on this call and having this conversation, because I think this is what is needed in the world right now in the greatest possible way. And as impersonal as these online platforms might seem, this is an incredible technology we have for creating international network of people who are all engaged in this way of being in the world. So thank you very much. I don't know how you're going to be sharing this, but if anybody wants to find me, it's very simple. It's just my name as my website, deusfortier.com, deusfortier.com.
Thank you so much, man. And I've done a lot of these conversations. I've worked with people a lot, and for anyone that that's looking for something real, it's clear to me Deus is on that and in that and sharing that. So I encourage you to check him out if you liked the conversation. And I absolutely will reach out, and I look forward to another conversation with you soon, my friend.
Yeah, likewise. Thanks, brother.
Yeah, take good care. Till next time.
All right.
Take it easy.
See ya.